At Colorado River Mile 98, the worst rapid in the Grand Canyon is younger than the boats running it. On June 25, 1983, three Tour West motor rigs carried 33 people into it, and within seconds, swimmers were scattered a mile downstream. Bill Wirt was pulled aboard without a pulse. There is no road here. The walls stand a mile deep, and the only ambulance is a helicopter. The first answer is simple. In December 1966, 14 inches of rain fell on the North Rim, and a mud flow dumped boulders into the river. That answer, it turns out, is incomplete, because rock alone does not explain Crystal Rapid. The river used to erase debris like that. Something changed that stopped it, and the thing that changed was built by people who were trying to make the Colorado safer. So keep 3 dates in your head as we go, because they are the whole story. 1966, when the rock arrived. 1983, when the water came. And 2007, when a man drowned here at an ordinary, unremarkable flow with no flood at all. I want to be careful about how I say this because the canyon deserves accuracy. A history written with the National Park Service says Crystal is said to have caused more damage and death than any rapid in the canyon. That is the claim we are going to test layer by layer until you understand not just that it is dangerous, but why it exists at all. Start with the geography, because everything downstream of this story is shaped by it. 98 river miles below Lee's Ferry, where boats put in, the canyon has cut nearly a mile down into the Colorado Plateau. To get to Crystal, you float almost 100 miles through rock older than most of the life on Earth. And once you are in there, you are committed. There is no shoulder to pull onto, no cell signal that means anything. The rim, when you can see it, is a thin, bright line a vertical mile above your head, and the trails that reach it are long, brutal, and few. This is the fact that governs every emergency in the canyon before it even begins. A broken leg on a road is an inconvenience. A broken leg at mile 98 is a helicopter mission, and the helicopter cannot simply land wherever it likes. It has to find a slot in a mile-deep gorge, in air that thins and heats in the afternoon, until a loaded machine can barely lift. And it has to be requested first, then authorized, then flown in. Every practical fact about survival here begins with those numbers: a mile deep, 100 miles in, and no fast way out that a person on the river controls. Now look at exactly where Crystal sits, because this is the first surprising thing. 2 side canyons meet the river here at almost the same point. Crystal Creek comes in and Slate Creek comes in, and they arrive at nearly the same spot on the Colorado. That is rare. In most of the Grand Canyon, a rapid is built by one side canyon dumping rock into the main channel. Here you have 2 mouths feeding a single throat. 2 debris fans crowding the same short stretch of river. Understand what a debris fan is, and you understand the whole canyon. When a desert cloudburst hits a side canyon, it does not send down a polite stream. The rain lands on bare rock and cannot soak in, so it gathers fast, picks up loose sediment, and turns into something between a flood and wet concrete. A slurry of mud thick enough to carry boulders the size of cars as if they were gravel. Where that side canyon empties into the Colorado, the current slows, the slurry drops its load, and the boulders pile up into a fan that shoves the river sideways and pinches it narrow. Every major rapid in the Grand Canyon sits at one of these mouths. The rapid is not in the river. The rapid is what the side canyon did to the river. So the pinch at Crystal is not natural, in the sense you might assume. It is manufactured, dumped in from the side, and the obvious question is the one that pulls us forward. If side canyons are always doing this, always throwing rock into the river, why is the whole Colorado not one continuous rapid? Why is most of it deep, green, and calm? The answer is the flood. Before there was a dam, the Colorado was a seasonal monster, and its violence was also its housekeeping. When the Rocky Mountain snowpack melted each spring, the river swelled to volumes that are hard to picture from a photograph. In 1884, gauges recorded something on the order of 300,000 cubic feet per second coming through here. Think about that number as a physical act rather than a statistic. At that flow, the river is not a river you would recognize. It is a moving hillside of water that reaches far up the banks, rolls boulders you could not budge with a truck, and grinds them downstream a little further every year. The annual flood was a machine that filed the teeth of every rapid down. It could not remove a debris fan outright, but it could rework it, tear off the biggest rocks, widen the gap the river had to squeeze through, and carry the finer material away. The rapids were dangerous, but they were dangerous within limits the river itself maintained, flood after flood, century after century. The old boatmen knew this in their bones, and their knowledge was a real system, not folklore. They read side canyons the way a sailor reads a sky. A dark thunderhead parked over a tributary meant that mouth might spit out a fresh load of rock within the hour. So you waited, you watched, you timed your run for the window when the runoff had settled and the water had cleared. They understood that the river was rewritten every spring, that this year's rapid was not last year's rapid, and they planned their lives around the plain fact that the water, not the rock, was in charge. That was the accumulated lesson of a century on this river. Then the lesson quietly stopped being true, and almost nobody noticed in time. Here is the reversal the whole story hangs on. In 1963, upstream at the top of the canyon, engineers closed Glen Canyon Dam. The dam was built for storage and power, to hold back the wild river and dole it out on a schedule that served cities and turbines rather than seasons. And it worked. It ended the floods. The 300,000 cubic foot spring surges simply stopped coming, replaced by steady, managed releases that rose and fell with the demand for electricity, from the surface that looked like the river being tamed. Underneath, something else happened. The United States Geological Survey put it plainly. Dam operation, it found, reduced the potential for reworking of debris fans. In ordinary language, the river lost its file. The machine that had ground those debris fans down for thousands of years was switched off. Rock that came down after 1963 would not be broken up and carried away. It would sit. It would accumulate. Geologists have a word for it: aggradation, the slow piling up of sediment that a river can no longer clear. The dam did not tame the rapids. It froze them in place and left them one storm away from becoming permanent. Sit with that, because it inverts the entire premise. The structure built to control the river is the reason the river can no longer control its own rapids. And into that new, frozen, unfiled river, in December 1966, the storm came. That December, the storm parked over the North Rim and dumped 14 inches in a matter of days, an enormous amount for that high desert. Most of a normal year's water delivered at once onto ground already saturated and cold. And the North Rim is built to concentrate it. It stands higher and wetter than the South Rim, and its side canyons drain long stretches of that high country down into a few narrow channels, so a storm spread across many square miles of plateau arrives at the river funneled into one violent chute. Crystal Creek gathered it and sent it down as a debris flow, the violent kind. Mud dense enough to float boulders the size of appliances and cars, moving in a single dark front rather than a rising stream. A debris flow does not behave like water. It behaves like fast, heavy, wet cement with rocks riding inside it. And when it stops almost all at once and sets, dropping its entire load in a pile instead of spreading it out. That is why the 1966 fan was so tight and so blocky. The river was handed a wall, not a slope. Before that week, Crystal was a riffle, a place you would not have named. The geologist Susan Kiefer later measured what the flow did to the channel, and the numbers tell the story cleanly. At a mature, river-worked debris fan, the Colorado is squeezed to roughly half its upstream width. At Crystal, after 1966, the constriction was tightened to about a quarter of the upstream width. The river was pinched to half of what even a normal rapid would do to it, because there had been no flood to push the new rock back out. It was installed in days, and now, with the dam upstream holding the floods, it could not be erased. The boatmen found out the hard way, and the timing of their discovery is the proof. Charts drawn before the storm showed almost nothing at mile 98. Then, in 1967, crews came around the bend and met a rapid that had not been there the year before, a monster that on the old 10-point scale earned a flat class 10, the top of it. A hazard the maps did not know about, born in a single December, and permanent because of a decision made 3 years earlier and 100 miles upstream. That is the trap fully assembled. Now let me show you exactly how it kills, because the mechanism is not mysterious. Once you see the physics, water is nearly incompressible. When you force a large volume of it through a narrow gap, it has to speed up, because the same amount has to get through a smaller opening in the same amount of time. So at the throat of Crystal, the river accelerates hard, and it crosses a threshold engineers describe by comparing the water's speed to the speed a wave can travel across its surface. Below that threshold, the flow is calm, and a disturbance can ripple upstream. Above it, the flow is what they call supercritical, moving faster than its own waves, which means the water downstream gets no warning that a wall of fast water is bearing down on it. Then that racing water slams into the deep, slow, heavy water pooled below the constriction. The energy has to go somewhere, and it goes upward and backward, dumping into a standing feature called a hydraulic jump. That is the technical name for what boatmen simply call the hole. It is a shock wave in water, a place where the river folds back on itself and a wave stands still while the current pours through and under it, curling upstream on the surface. In a natural, unconstricted channel, a feature like this barely forms and cannot hold. Here, at high flow, the hole can stretch across nearly the whole river, deep enough and violent enough that a boat dropping into it is not riding a wave, it is falling into a recirculating wall of water. And that recirculation is the thing that hurts people. On the surface, part of the hole runs backward, upstream, tumbling back into itself, so a boat that stalls in it is not simply stopped, it is held and worked, pitched and dragged, while the current pours over the tubes and tries to peel loose anything that is not tied down, gear and people included. That is why a raft too big to flip can still be emptied. The hole does not have to turn the boat over to win. It only has to hold it long enough. And when the hole spans the river, there is no clean line through it. There is only where the boat happens to be and how much luck it has. So why did anyone keep running it? Because by the 1970s, stopping was not really an option. And understanding why is the key to every death that follows. Permits were issued for fixed launch dates that outfitters waited years to receive. Companies had schedules, payrolls, and paying passengers who were already 90 miles into a canyon with no exit and a plane to catch at the end. And a new kind of boat had taken over the commercial trade. The big motor rig, a heavy pontoon inflatable pushed by an outboard, could carry a dozen or more passengers and punch through waves that would stand a smaller craft on end. The motor rigs made the trip faster, cheaper per head, and on most days safer. But they carried a hidden cost that Crystal was built to collect. They were too big and too heavy to carry around a rapid. On a small boat, if a rapid looks like death, you can portage, unload your gear, and walk your boat and your people around it on the bank. You cannot portage a motor rig. The very technology that opened the river to ordinary people also quietly removed the oldest escape hatch there is. Bigger boats, more passengers, the same manufactured throat, and no way around it. And the pressure to run it was not abstract. By the time a commercial trip reached Crystal, it had been on the river for days. On a launch date, the outfitter had waited a long time to get in a permit system that allotted only so many trips a season. The passengers had paid, had flown in, had jobs and flights and lives waiting at the takeout downstream. Turning back was not an option, because upstream is the one direction a boat on the Colorado cannot go. Stopping to wait was barely one, because there is nowhere at Crystal to hold 33 people indefinitely. The whole weight of the operation pushed in a single direction, forward, through the throat. And everyone in the trade understood it. For 16 years, the arrangement mostly held. Crews learned Crystal, respected it, ran it, and passed the knowledge down. Then the second date arrived. And this time the danger did not come from a side canyon at all. It came from the dam itself, the same structure that had frozen the rapid in the first place. The winter of 1982 into 1983 loaded the Rocky Mountains with snow. The Bureau of Reclamation, which runs Glen Canyon Dam, wanted Lake Powell as full as it could safely be because a full reservoir means more water banked for dry years and more power sold, and the early runoff forecasts did not scream emergency. So through the spring, the lake was held high, with little room left in it. Then the mountains gave a concrete warning that the models had underweighted. A heavy, late snowpack sat under an unusually cool spring, refusing to melt on the calendar the forecasters expected. Instead of releasing gradually, it held, and then let go in a rush when the weather finally turned warm all at once. Suddenly, far more water was pouring into a reservoir that had almost no capacity left to absorb it, and the operators were behind the curve on a system that does not forgive being behind. The dam has 3 ways to pass water, and it is worth knowing them in order, because the disaster is the story of using them up one at a time. The power plant, running its turbines flat out, can move roughly 28,000 cubic feet per second. 2 outlet works, jets low in the dam, add maybe 15,000 more. And then, for true overflow, there are 2 spillway tunnels bored through the solid sandstone of the canyon walls, each one meant to be used rarely, almost never. As the lake climbed toward the crest of the dam, the operators opened the left spillway on June 2nd. 4 days later, on June 6th, they heard it. A deep rumbling and pounding coming up through the concrete from inside the mountain. That sound is the worst news an engineer at a dam can get. It meant cavitation. When water moves fast enough over a small imperfection in a surface, the local pressure drops so low that the water briefly flashes into vapor. And when those vapor bubbles are swept into higher pressure downstream, they collapse, each one imploding with a tiny, ferocious hammer blow. Millions of them, thousands of times a second, will chew through concrete and then bite into the rock behind it. The spillway was eating itself, and the mountain around it, faster the more water they sent through. Now watch the options disappear, because that vanishing is the shape of every disaster in this canyon. The power plant was maxed. The outlets were maxed. Shutting the damaged spillway meant letting the lake keep rising toward the top of the dam, which was unthinkable. So the engineers did something that sounds like desperation, because it was. They bolted sheets of plywood 4 feet high onto the tops of the spillway gates, makeshift flashboards to steal a few more feet of storage out of a rising reservoir while they fought to control the release. Plywood, holding back Lake Powell, it held. But to save the dam, they had no choice but to keep passing water. And all of that water went where water from that dam always goes, straight down the canyon, through every rapid past everyone on the river. Downstream at Lee's Ferry, the flow peaked around 97,300 cubic feet per second, the highest release in the dam's history. When they finally shut the left spillway and sent people in to look, the tunnel had been gutted. scoured more than 30 feet deep into the sandstone in places, whole sections of its concrete lining and the rock beneath simply gone. They saved the dam. Afterward, engineers had to rebuild the tunnels and fit them with aerators, devices that mix air into the flow to cushion the water against the surface and blunt the cavitation so it could never happen the same way again. But in that June, the way they saved the dam was to aim the crisis straight down the canyon at the boats. And the boats were down there in it. Crystal at nearly 100,000 cubic feet per second was a different animal than the one the boatmen knew. The hole grew until it spanned the river, and the story of those few days in June is really the story of how a rapid behaves once it has outgrown every map, every rating, and every rule anyone had for it. Georgie White ran it first, in a sense on everyone's behalf. She was a legend on this river, a woman who had spent decades running the Colorado when the trade was almost entirely men. And she ran the biggest boat of all, 3 motor rigs lashed side by side into a single massive raft she called a triple rig, built precisely so that nothing on the river could flip her. On June 23rd, she took it into Crystal, and the hole proved her half right. It could not turn the triple rig over. It was too wide, too heavy, too much boat to flip. So the hole did the other thing instead. It caught that enormous raft and shook it like a dog shakes a rag, and the passengers were thrown off it into the river while the boat itself stayed upright and floated on. Everyone was recovered alive, but the lesson was ugly and specific. Mass could beat the hole and still lose the people, because the hole did not need to flip you to empty you. And if the largest raft on the river could not pass Crystal clean, the question hanging over the next crew was obvious and cold. What happens to a smaller one? 2 days later, on June 25th, Tour West gave the answer. 3 motor rigs, 33 people, a scheduled commercial run, an experienced outfit. This was not a reckless crew charging in blind. The lead boatman, Dave Stratton, stopped and scouted the rapid for 45 minutes from 3 different angles, which is exactly what the situation demanded and exactly what a careful boatman does. He read the water and chose what river runners call the turnaround run, hugging the right shore and threading along the edge over the tops of drowned tamarisk trees the flood had submerged, trying to sneak past the shoulder of the hole, rather than punch through its center. It was a defensible plan, built from a careful read and executed by people who knew what they were doing. And it was not enough, because the river that day was bigger than any plan drawn for it. The run went wrong. People went into the water. And once a person is out of the boat at Crystal in a flood like that, a new set of physics takes over, and none of it is on their side. The Colorado below Glen Canyon Dam comes off the bottom of Lake Powell, so even in summer it runs shockingly cold. Cold enough that within minutes, a strong swimmer's hands stop closing and their breathing goes ragged and shallow. The current does not let go either. A mile of fast water carried the swimmers downstream before anyone could reach them, and every one of those minutes in that cold stole strength that a person in the river cannot get back. And now the second complication arrived, the one that turns an accident into a catastrophe. The rescuers themselves became victims of the same rapid. Stratton and 2 others, Gallagher and Paparelli, went in after the swimmers and were caught by the same monstrous current and swept a mile downstream into the very water they were trying to pull people out of. This is the part outsiders never expect. A rescue at Crystal in that flow was not a safe, separate operation conducted from the bank with ropes. It was a second group of people entering the exact hazard that had just proven it could take anyone, and hoping the river would let them and the swimmers both go before the cold did its work. Spread over a mile of the Colorado, the crew fought to gather 33 people out of moving water. Bill Wirt was pulled from the river without a pulse. A passenger, Sulzer, was critically injured, and now the geography that had been quietly waiting through this whole story stepped forward and set the terms. There was no road, no ambulance, No hospital within reach by land in any amount of time that mattered. The only way out was up, through the one narrow route the canyon allows, and that meant the slow machinery of a backcountry rescue had to turn over. Someone had to recognize how bad it was, get word out of a canyon with no easy communication, reach the Park Service, and get a helicopter authorized and flown deep into the canyon, to a spot near the river, far below the rim where it could actually get down and lift injured people back out. Until it arrived, the injured had to be kept alive on a strip of sand at the water's edge by the same crew that had just pulled them out of the river. Help does not begin when the helicopter appears over the rim. It begins with recognition, then a call that has to physically leave the canyon, then authorization, then the flight, then finding a place to land, then the transfer, and each of those steps costs time that an injured, hypothermic person does not have to spare. The injured were lifted out, up and over the rim, to reach the kind of care that at road level would have been minutes away, and here was a flight and a chain of decisions away. And then the superintendent of the park did something that had never been done here before. He closed Crystal Rapid. He ordered a mandatory portage, the first time the Park Service ever required boaters to walk around a rapid anywhere in the Grand Canyon. For an outfit built entirely around boats too heavy to carry, that order was an admission that the rapid had, at that flow, defeated the equipment that was supposed to master it. Think about what that admission meant. The lesson of that day was not that someone was careless. Stratton scouted correctly and chose a line a good boatman could defend. The lesson was that a correct read and a careful plan could still lose to a wave that had outgrown the map it was drawn on. And the deepest reversal of the day is the quiet one. At Crystal, in that flood, the safest place to be was not in any boat at all. It was on the shore, on foot, walking around the thing. But not everyone was walking. While the park was closing the rapid, 3 men were preparing to run the entire canyon in the middle of the flood, at night, on purpose. Kenton Grua, Rudy Petchek, and Steve Reynolds had an idea most people would call insane, and a few would call the finest piece of rowing in the river's history. They wanted the speed record for the whole Grand Canyon, and they understood something the crisis at the dam had just made true. The flood that was killing people was also the fastest the Colorado would ever move. A current that could carry a boat 277 miles in a day and a half. So on the night of June 26, they launched quietly and illegally in a 17-foot wooden dory named the Emerald Mile, a boat far smaller and more fragile than the motor rigs the hole had just been emptying. At around 72,000 cubic feet per second, they came into Crystal in the dark, and the same hole that had shaken Georgie White's triple rig flipped their little dory clean over. They were separated in the water. Accounts differ on how far Reynolds was carried before they got back together, and I will not pretend to a precision the record does not support. But they recovered the boat, righted it, climbed back in, and kept going. And they ran all 277 miles of the Grand Canyon in 36 hours, 38 minutes, and 29 seconds, a record that stood for decades. Here is what that run actually proves, and it is not what it looks like. It is tempting to say they lived because they were the best on the river, and they were superb. But the motor rigs had superb boatmen too. Stratton scouted for 45 minutes and still lost a man. The Emerald Mile flipped in the same hole as everyone else and only got lucky in the recovery. Skill was not the thing that separated the outcomes that week. Timing was. Whether you lived or died at Crystal in June 1983 depended most of all on how much water the dam was sending down the canyon at the exact moment your boat reached the throat. And that number was being set by engineers 100 miles upstream who were fighting to save a wall of concrete and had no idea and no way to care who was in a boat below them. The variable everyone assumes is the person. The variable was the gauge. Which brings us to the third date and to the most unsettling death of all, Because this one happened with no flood, no drama, and no mistake anyone could point to. On March 30th, 2007, Mark Allred, 62 years old, was on a private trip through the canyon. The water was low, ordinary, nothing remotely like 1983. His boat did not flip. It simply hit the first hole in crystal and threw him out of it, into cold water, and he drowned. Everything the story had taught to that point involved too much water, a manufactured flood, a dam in crisis. And here the rapid killed a man at a flow that thousands of people run every year without incident. There is a complication in the record I have to flag honestly, and then set to one side. An initial toxicology report described a blood alcohol level high enough to have killed him before he ever reached the water, and a second review attributed to the county medical examiner contradicted that and ruled it out. The accounts conflict, and they rest on a single secondary source. So I will not tell you which is true, because I do not know. What is not in dispute is the plain, terrible fact underneath the argument. He was thrown from a boat that never flipped, at low water, on an ordinary day, and he did not come out, which forces the last and hardest reversal. You never needed the flood. The trap was always there. The 1983 water made it spectacular, front page, unforgettable. But the constriction a 1966 storm installed, and that a dam upstream can no longer erase, is lethal at ordinary flow, to a careful person doing everything a private boater is supposed to do. So let me close the loops we opened, because the answers are all in your hands now. Who filled the river? A December storm in 1966, and the accident of a second side canyon feeding the same throat. Why could the river not fix it? Because in 1963 a dam upstream ended the floods that used to file the rock away. Why not just walk around? Because the boats that made the river accessible to ordinary people were too heavy to carry, and because by the time you are at Crystal, you are 98 miles from anywhere, with no road out and a helicopter that is an hour of complications away. Why did the boatmen so often live while passengers died? Because the hole did not need to flip a boat to empty it. And because in a flood, the rescuers had to enter the same water that had just taken the people they were trying to save. And there is one final turn, and it is the river's own grim edit of the story. The 1983 flood, the one that nearly ate the dam, did one more thing on its way through. It shoved a great load of debris downstream of the constriction and built up what boatmen now call the Rock Garden, a field of exposed boulders below the main hole. The disaster remodeled its own trap. It rearranged Crystal in a way that made the hazard harder to miss at low water, which is part of why an ordinary March day in 2007 could kill a careful man. The flood did not just test the rapid. It rebuilt it, worse, and then receded and left the new version behind. Today the danger is quieter, but it has not gone anywhere. And the reason it is quieter has nothing to do with anyone deciding the river is safe. Long drought has drawn Lake Powell far down, and a release like 1983's, near 100,000 cubic feet per second, is now unlikely. Not because the dam is safer, but because the reservoir is too low and too precious to spill. The controlled high-flow experiments the Bureau now runs on purpose to push sediment through the canyon and rebuild its beaches top out somewhere around 41 to 45,000 cubic feet per second, less than half of the 1983 peak. The Great Flood may never come to Crystal again, but that was never the thing that made Crystal. What made Crystal was one night of rain on the North Rim in 1966, falling into a river that a dam had quietly stripped of its power to forget. So picture it as it is right now, at low water, on a day when nothing is going wrong. A crew reaches mile 98 and ties off on the right, and they climb out and walk the same scout path Dave Stratton walked in 1983, up onto the rock where the whole rapid lays out below them. Down in the throat is the boulder the 1966 storm left, sitting exactly where it landed, unmoved by anything the river has done in the 60 years since. Behind them, 100 miles upstream and out of sight, is a reservoir so low it may never flood the canyon again. And above all of it, the side canyon waits, dry and patient, the way it has waited the whole time. It does not need the dam. It does not need the flood. It only needs one night of rain,